The door nearly came off its rusted hinges when Chester Merritt's boot connected with the rotting wood of the threshold, and Georgia Wilcox spun around so fast that the candle she was holding sent hot wax splashing across her wrist. He filled the entire doorframe, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, badge catching the last pale light of the dying Kansas sun, jaw set like quarried stone, and those dark eyes, those impossibly dark eyes, locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath seize in her chest like a caught animal. "You are not sleeping in that broken cabin one more night," he said. Not a question, not a suggestion. A declaration made by a man who had spent 12 years enforcing the law in Caldwell, Kansas, and who had never once in all that time bothered to lower his voice for anyone. Georgia's chin came up. She had not survived 3 years of widowhood and 2 brutal Kansas winters by being the kind of woman who folded when a man used that tone on her. "Marshal Merritt, you can take yourself right back down that hill and leave me to my own business." He did not move, not 1 inch. Rain had started falling somewhere behind him, soft and relentless, and it darkened the shoulders of his canvas duster and plastered the brim of his hat against his forehead, and still he did not move, and the way he was looking at her, not with anger, she realized suddenly, not purely with anger, made something dangerous shift inside her chest. "I found the beam," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, which was somehow worse than when it had been loud. "The main support beam in the northeast corner. It is cracked clean through, Georgia. One hard wind, the kind of wind this territory has been throwing all week, and that roof comes down on you while you are sleeping." Her name in his mouth. He had never said her first name before, not once in the 8 months since she had arrived in Caldwell to claim the small homestead her late husband Hale Wilcox had purchased before his death in a cattle drive gone wrong. Every interaction between them had been Marshal Merritt and Mrs. Wilcox, stiff and formal as a church pew, and now here he was in her doorway in the rain saying Georgia like he had always said it, like it was the most natural word he knew. She set the candle down on the warped windowsill because her hand had started to tremble, and she absolutely refused to let him see that. "I appreciate your concern," she said, and the formality of the words felt like armor. "I will be fine." "You will not be fine." He stepped inside. 1 step, just one, but it brought him out of the rain and into the tiny, cold space that she had been trying to make into something resembling a home, and the cabin seemed to shrink around them both. "I am not asking you, and I am not suggesting it. Pack what you need for tonight. You are coming to town." But to understand how Georgia Wilcox and Chester Merritt had arrived at that charged and rain-soaked threshold moment, you had to go back. Back to 8 months earlier, when a woman carrying nothing but a carpetbag, a grief she had not yet learned to set down, and a stubborn streak wide enough to shame a mule, had stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad into the wind-blasted town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878. Georgia had been 26 years old. She had brown hair that did what it wanted, gray eyes the color of a sky before snow, and hands that were already calloused from the work of surviving. She had come from Ohio, from a town called Millbrook, where she had spent the first year of her widowhood being slowly, politely, devastatingly smothered by her mother-in-law's charity and her own helplessness. When she found the deed to the Kansas homestead among Hale's papers, 160 acres filed under the Homestead Act, mostly grassland and a small creek and that little cabin, she had made up her mind in the space of one quiet morning. She was going west. She was going to build something of her own. She was going to stop being a woman that things happened to and start being a woman who made things happen. Caldwell in the autumn of 1878 was not a gentle place to begin such an ambition. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, which meant it processed cattle and cattlemen and all the trouble that traveled with both. It had 4 saloons, 2 dry goods stores, a church, a livery, a newspaper office, a doctor's surgery that doubled as a dentist's office, and a marshal's office that Chester Merritt ran with the quiet, iron competence of a man who had decided long ago that order was worth fighting for and had never changed his mind about it. Georgia's first sight of Chester Merritt had been from across the dusty main street of Caldwell. She had been asking the man at the livery stable about hiring a wagon to take her out to the homestead, and the livery man had been explaining, not unkindly, but with that particular brand of practical hopelessness that men in the West reserved for women who showed up alone, that the road out to the Wilcox property was not in good condition, and maybe she ought to think about whether she really wanted to do this. She had been replying with great precision that she did really want to do this when she became aware that the street had gone quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a slow afternoon, the particular taut silence that meant something was wrong. A man had come out of the Longhorn Saloon moving sideways, the way a man moves when he has been drinking since morning and the ground beneath him has become an unreliable partner. He was large and red-faced, and he had his hand on the revolver at his hip, and he was shouting something at a figure still inside the saloon. The people on the boardwalk had pressed themselves back against the storefronts with the practiced speed of people who had done it before. Chester Merritt had come out of his office. He had not run. He had walked, that particular walk that Georgia would come to know over the following months, the walk that was unhurried in a way that was somehow more commanding than urgency would have been. He had positioned himself between the drunk man and the saloon doorway, arms loose at his sides, and he had spoken in a voice that carried cleanly across the silent street. "Roy," he had said, "put it down." Georgia had not been able to hear what Roy said back, but she had watched Chester Merritt's face and it had not changed. Not one degree of expression shifted. He had taken 3 slow steps forward, until he was close enough that any shot the drunk man fired would have hit him, and that proximity, that complete willingness to put himself in the line of it, had evidently communicated something that words had failed to, because Roy's hand had dropped from the gun. Chester had taken the weapon with the calm ease of a man lifting a book off a shelf, said something else that made Roy nod like a chastened boy, and steered him back inside. The whole street exhaled. Georgia had realized she was gripping the livery stable's hitching post with both hands. She had released it and looked at her own whitened knuckles and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that is a man who does not waste himself. She had not thought anything more specific than that. She had certainly not thought anything that could be called romantic. She had a homestead to claim and a life to build, and the last thing she needed was to complicate either of those things. The livery man had found her a wagon. She had driven herself out to the homestead that very afternoon. The cabin, when she saw it, was exactly as bad as it looked in the description she had constructed from Hale's letter and her own imagination, and worse in several ways she had not anticipated. The roof was sound, but the walls had settled crookedly against themselves, and the door hung at an angle that required force to open or close. The inside had been occupied at some point by something that was not human, and the smell informed her of this immediately. The creek was real and clean, which was the most hopeful thing about it. The land itself was genuinely beautiful, even in the brittle gold of late autumn, a rolling sweep of grass with a line of cottonwood trees along the water, and a sky so enormous and so blue that it made her feel small and free at the same time. She had stood in the middle of that crooked, malodorous little cabin and felt grief hit her again, fresh and specific. Not grief for Hale exactly. Their marriage had been steady rather than passionate, built on mutual respect and shared practical goals, but grief for the future they had planned together that now she was going to have to build alone. She had allowed herself 10 minutes of it, sitting on the floor because there was no furniture yet, letting the feeling move through her. Then she had gotten up, gone back to the wagon, and gotten to work. The first 3 months had been the hardest of her life and also, in some ways, she would later reflect, the most clarifying. She was not entirely without skills. She could cook and she could keep house and she had a good practical mind. But she had never laid a fire in a crumbling hearth or hauled water from a creek in freezing temperatures or tried to drive a fence post into ground that was basically iron in November. She learned all of it. She made mistakes that cost her time and energy. She kept going. The people in Caldwell sorted themselves, as people do, into those who helped, and those who watched, and those who actively resented her presence. Millicent Howe, who ran the dry goods store on the south end of Main Street with her husband Claude, was the first to be genuinely kind. She had taken one look at Georgia's hands, blistered, raw, missing a thumbnail from a hammer accident, and had handed her a tin of salve without commentary, and their friendship had begun in that silent, practical gesture. The doctor, a spare man named Elias Ford in his middle 50s who had come west from Philadelphia and seemed perpetually bemused that he had done so, was the second. He had checked her over for frostbite after a particularly bad cold snap in December, and had given her a lecture about nutrition and adequate sleep that she had appreciated more than she admitted. Chester Merritt had been harder to categorize. He had come out to the homestead in her second week. Just appeared, riding a dark bay horse, carrying a length of good rope and a box of mixed hardware supplies, nails and hinges and hooks. He had tied his horse to the cottonwood nearest the cabin and walked up and knocked on the door frame. He could not knock on the actual door since it was propped open at a permanent 45-degree angle, and said, without preamble, "You need a better door hinge. The kind you've got on there won't survive winter." Georgia had looked at him for a moment. She had recognized him from the street, the Marshal, the man who had walked toward the drunk man with a gun without changing his pace. Up close he was older than she had initially thought, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that showed the weather and the years but was not, strictly speaking, hard to look at. Firm jaw, long nose slightly crooked from an old break, dark eyes under heavy brows, and a mouth that appeared to be in genuine conflict between its natural expressiveness and his determination to reveal nothing. "I am aware of the hinge," she had said. "I have the replacement on order from the dry goods." "I have one," he had said, and held up the box. She had looked at the box. She had looked at him. She had thought about pride and decided that pragmatism was going to have to win. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He had fixed the hinge and the latch and reseated the doorframe while he was at it, and done all of it without commentary beyond the occasional practical question. "Do you have a hammer? Where did you want this hook?" That sort of thing. He had been gone inside an hour. He had not asked for payment or thanks, had simply mounted his bay horse and ridden back toward town. Georgia had watched him go with the uncomfortable feeling that she owed someone something, and she was not sure what or to whom, and she did not like the feeling at all. He came back 3 more times in that first month, always with a practical purpose, always without announcement. A piece of stovepipe when hers cracked. Help resetting a fence post she had placed incorrectly. Once, bafflingly, with a sack of dried beans and a wheel of cheese, which he left on her doorstep without knocking, and which she discovered only when she nearly tripped over it coming back from the creek. She had carried it inside, stared at it for a long moment, and then had cooked herself a meal that was the first decent one she had eaten since arriving in Kansas, and had felt something complicated and inconvenient bloom somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. She had asked Millicent Howe about it, being careful about her phrasing. She had asked, in what she hoped was a tone of pure general curiosity, whether Marshal Merritt made it a habit of looking in on homesteaders. Millicent had given her a look that suggested George's phrasing had not been as careful as she intended. "Chester Merritt," Millicent had said, arranging bolts of calico on the store counter, "has been the law in this town for 12 years, and in all that time I have never known him to go out of his way for anyone without a solid reason." She had paused. "He helped the Bauer family last spring after their barn burned. He helped old widow Tremming when her son abandoned the family claim. Good man, just not a forthcoming one." Another pause. "He does not often notice women," Georgia had said. "I am not asking you to speculate on whether he has noticed me." Millicent had smiled, the particular smile of a woman who had been married for 20 years and knew perfectly well what was being asked of her. "Of course not," she said. The winter deepened. Georgia Wilcox worked harder than she had ever worked in her life and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she did not hate it. There was a specific kind of satisfaction in a task completed by your own hands, in a fence that stood because you had made it stand, in a fire that burned because you had laid it and tended it. She was not comfortable, and she was not warm enough, and she was often lonely in the particular acute way that silence becomes when you are not accustomed to it. But she was also more fully herself than she had been in years. She began trading at the Caldwell market on Saturdays. She had started putting in kitchen garden vegetables the previous autumn, turnips and potatoes mostly, root vegetables that would keep, and she brought what surplus she had into town and traded it for things she needed. This brought her into regular contact with the town, and with Chester Merritt, who moved through Caldwell on his regular circuit with that unhurried, watchful walk she had come to recognize from half a block away. They developed a pattern. Not a friendship exactly. The gap between them was too formal for that, too careful on both sides, but something. He would acknowledge her on the street with a small nod that was subtly different from the nod he gave other people, though she could not have said precisely how. Occasionally he would stop and exchange a word about practical matters, the weather, conditions on the road out to her property, whether the hardware store had received a particular item she had been waiting for. He always knew the answer. He paid attention to the details of the town and the people in it with a comprehensiveness that would have been unnerving if she hadn't already identified it as the habit of a man who considered it his job to know things. She began to notice other things about him. That he ate his lunch at the same time every day, at the small table outside Ruthie McAllister's boarding house, where Ruthie served meals to paying guests and non-paying Marshals both. That he read. She had seen him more than once with a book, which surprised her and then made her feel vaguely ashamed of having been surprised. That he had a particular way of looking at someone who was lying to him that was not aggressive and not threatening, but was instead perfectly, devastatingly patient, as though he had all the time in the world and was quite certain the truth would eventually find its own way out. She had been on the receiving end of that look exactly once. In February, when she had told him that the cabin roof was holding up just fine after a bad ice storm, when in fact 2 shingles had come loose and she had spent a sleepless night lying in her bunk with a tin bucket positioned under the drip and telling herself she would fix it in the morning. He had looked at her with that patient, knowing look for precisely 3 seconds, and then had said, "I will be out there Thursday with shingles." She had opened her mouth to argue and had found, somehow, that she had already closed it again. He came on Thursday with shingles and a borrowed ladder. He had fixed the roof in an hour and a half. She had made him coffee because she owed him at minimum that, and they had sat at her small table, the first time they had sat in the same room for longer than a transaction required, and they had talked. Really talked, not the brief exchanges on Main Street. She had told him about Ohio and about Millbrook and about the slow suffocation of living in her mother-in-law's house. He had listened with that complete attention he brought to things, that sense of being genuinely present, which was not as common a quality as people liked to believe. He had not told her much about himself. He answered questions directly but offered nothing that had not been asked for. She had asked where he was from, and he had said Missouri, and offered nothing more. She had asked how he had come to be a marshal, and he had said he had been a deputy sheriff in Wichita before being offered the Caldwell position in 1866, and there was something briefly complicated in his expression when he said it, a flicker of something, not quite pain, more like a careful avoidance of it, that she noted and did not press. After he left that day, she sat for a long time in the quiet of the cabin and thought about secrets. Everyone had them. She had her own. The things she had not told anyone in Caldwell, not Millicent, not even Dr. Ford, was that Hale Wilcox's death had not been entirely the accident the cattle drive foreman had described in his letter. There had been a fight, a dispute over pay between Hale and the drive boss, a man named Garrett Holt, that had turned violent. The drive boss's version of events, Hale slipped and fell into the river crossing, had satisfied the sheriff in Dodge City where the incident occurred. Georgia's private knowledge, gathered from a letter Hale had written her 3 days before his death describing the dispute in full, suggested that the truth was not so accidental. But she had no proof beyond a dead man's letter, and Garrett Holt was still working cattle drives out of Dodge City, and there was nothing she could do about any of it that would not simply destroy her. She had buried that knowledge along with her husband and come west to build something from what remained. But it sat in her like a splinter she couldn't reach, an injury that hadn't properly healed, and on the long nights when the wind came screaming down off the plains and the walls of the cabin shook around her, she felt it more sharply than ever. Spring came to the Kansas prairie with a violence that matched winter's departure, thunderstorms that rolled in off the horizon with visible malevolence and turned the creek briefly into a genuine river. Georgia's fields were planting ready by April. She put in corn and winter wheat and expanded her kitchen garden. She hired a man named Pete Abernathy, a young drifter who turned out to be a decent worker and completely honest, to help her with the heavier work for 3 weeks, and between them they got the major planting done. It was during this spring period that the situation with the cabin began to become genuinely critical, though Georgia did not fully acknowledge this. The winter's ice and freeze-thaw cycles had done something to the foundation that she could feel rather than see a slight but perceptible increase in the way the floor flexed in the corner near the northeast wall. The door stuck more than before. The main support beam, the heavy timber that ran across the ceiling and bore the weight of the roof above it, had developed a crack that she had first noticed in March and told herself was superficial. By May it had widened. She put her worries about the cabin in the same category as her worries about Garrett Holt. In the drawer she labeled things she could not currently fix and must therefore not obsess over. Chester Merritt found out about the beam the way he found out about most things in his jurisdiction, by being methodical and observant and entirely undetectable while being both. He had stopped by the homestead in early June, ostensibly to discuss a property line question with a neighboring claim that had generated a minor dispute, and while Georgia was finding the relevant paperwork, he had stood in the middle of the cabin and simply looked, not obtrusively, not in a way that announced itself. Just stood with his coffee cup and his particular quality of focused attention, and he had seen it, the crack in the beam. The way the northeast corner of the ceiling had dropped approximately 3/4 of an inch from where it had been last autumn, judging by the nail marks she had made in the wall when she first arrived. He had not said anything then. He had taken his paperwork information, thanked her, and left. But he had gone back to Caldwell and stood for a long time at his office window looking out at the street without seeing it, and he had felt something in his chest that he recognized and did not particularly welcome. It was the particular clenching sensation of impending danger aimed at someone you cared about, and its appearance informed him, not for the first time but with more clarity than before, that he cared about Georgia Wilcox in a way that had moved well beyond the category of civic concern. This was a problem. Chester Merritt was 36 years old and had spent approximately a quarter of that life making very certain that he did not allow himself to feel precisely this thing. The history behind that determination was buried in Missouri, and in a name he did not speak, a woman named Clara who had married him when he was 22 and been left a widow at 24 because he had been too stubborn and too reckless and too certain he was untouchable. And the consequences of that certainty had included a bullet that had taken 18 months to recover from and had not taken his life only by an accident of angle. Clara had remarried. He had become the kind of Marshal he was now, the careful, methodical, controlled kind, and had decided that the two things, who he was in his work and the kind of vulnerable happiness that came with love, were incompatible. He had held to that decision for 14 years. Georgia Wilcox, with her gray eyes and her stubborn chin and her calloused hands and the way she looked at a problem like it was personally offensive to her, was making it very difficult to keep holding. He knew she had secrets. He had recognized it from their first real conversation, the way someone who has kept secrets of their own recognizes the shape of it in another person. He had not pushed. He had told himself it was not his business. He had gone on bringing her rope and hardware and shingles and dried beans, and had told himself each time that it was simply what a decent person did for a neighbor who was struggling, and had gradually, over several months, acknowledged to himself that this was the largest lie he had ever told himself, and he was a man who prided himself on not lying. In June, two things happened that changed everything. The first was Garrett Holt. Holt had come up the Kisham Trail with a cattle drive out of Texas, pushing a herd of longhorns toward the Caldwell stockyards. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that Georgia Wilcox, who had come into town on a Saturday morning for her market trading, had seen him across the street and had gone the color of chalk. Chester, who happened to be crossing the street himself at that moment, had been close enough to see her face and had stopped. Georgia, her name again without thinking about it. He had been saying her name in his own head for months. What is it? She had turned to look at him, and something had moved across her face, fear and anger, and something harder underneath both of them, a cold, specific fury. And then her jaw had set, and she had arranged her expression into something controlled. "Nothing," she said. "I am sorry, someone I recognized." He had looked at the man she had been watching. Big man, mid-40s, leather vest, the red, weathered face of a man who spent his life in the sun. The Drive Boss's brand was a double-ring brand registered out of Dodge City. Chester had noted it with the automatic habit of a man who cataloged everything. "Georgia," he said again, more quietly, "that man frightened you." "I am not frightened," she said, which was not the same as saying he had not frightened her, and they both knew it. He had let it go then. But that night, he had written a letter to the sheriff in Dodge City, a man named Albert Pruitt whom he had known for 8 years, asking for any records pertaining to a cattle drive incident in the autumn of 1875, involving fatalities and a drive boss named Garrett Holt. The second thing that happened in June was the storm. It came up on a Wednesday night, the kind of storm that Kansas springs and summers produce with a casual ferocity that never entirely loses its power to astonish. Chester had been at his desk finishing reports when the barometric pressure drop became unmistakable, that particular heaviness in the air that experienced plains dwellers learned to read like a language. He had looked out at the sky, which was a color green that had no business being in a sky, and felt his stomach drop. Georgia Wilcox was 3 miles outside of town in a cabin with a cracked main support beam. He had been on his horse before he had fully formed the decision to go. The storm hit when he was halfway there, not the frontal squall but the leading edge of it, sharp horizontal rain and a wind that was serious enough to lean into. He had bent over his horse's neck and kept moving. He had seen, when he crested the small rise that gave a view of the homestead, that the light was still on in the cabin. One candle behind a window. She was awake. She was in there. He had felt the ground-level fear of it, the knowledge of that beam, the knowledge of the wind with a clarity that cut through everything else, and he had ridden down the hill and thrown himself off the horse and gone to the cabin door, which was how he found himself in her doorway, soaking wet, telling her she was not sleeping in that broken cabin one more night. She looked at him for a long moment after he stepped inside. The candle on the windowsill threw moving shadows across them both, and the wind outside was picking up, and above their heads the cracked beam made a sound that was not quite a groan but was in the neighborhood of one. "You cannot make me leave my own home," she said, but her voice was less certain than her words, and he heard it, and she heard that he heard it. "I am not trying to make you do anything," he said, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it. "I am asking you to be reasonable." "Being reasonable," she said, "is how women end up in situations they did not choose. I have been reasonable my entire life. I am tired of reasonable." Something shifted in him. He had not expected that. He had expected stubbornness. He knew her well enough by now to expect stubbornness. But not this, not the rawness underneath it, the real thing she was saying about her life and what had happened to her, and why this cabin mattered so much that she was willing to stay in it when the roof might come down. "Georgia," he said, and this time when he said her name it was different, softer and more direct than he had ever let it be. "I know this is yours. I know what it cost you to get here and to stay here. I know that leaving feels like losing." He paused, searching for words that were not natural to him, words that revealed something. "But I need you to be safe. He started again. "I cannot go back to town and leave you here with that beam, knowing what I know." The wind hit the side of the cabin with a sound like a fist, and above them the creak of the structure was unmistakable now, the whole roof shifting slightly on its damaged support, and Georgia's eyes went up involuntarily and then back to his face, and the conflict in her expression was something he felt in his own chest. "How did you even know about the beam?" she asked, and her voice was quieter. "I looked," he said simply. She stared at him. "You have been watching my cabin." "I have been watching out for you," he said. "There is a difference." Another sound from above, worse than the last. He held her gaze. "Please." That single word. He did not say please easily. She knew enough about him by now to know that, and the knowledge of what it cost him to say it arrived in her chest with a force she had not prepared for. She looked around the cabin. At the walls she had cleaned and tried to make habitable, the shelf she had nailed up herself, the curtains she had sewn from fabric Millicent Howe had given her. Then she looked at Chester Merritt, standing in her cabin in the rain with his dark eyes asking her to trust him. She picked up her carpet bag. She began, with movements that were deliberate and unhurried because she would not flee, to put things into it. Her medical kit, the warm spare dress, Hale's letter which she kept under the loose floorboard near the hearth and which she retrieved now without looking at Chester, tucking it into the bag before he could see it clearly. He waited. He did not say anything while she packed, and she was grateful for that. They went out into the storm together. He had hitched his horse under the cottonwood, which was some shelter. He helped her mount, which required them to be briefly physically closer than they had ever been, his hand steadying her at the elbow as she swung up, and even through the chaos of wind and rain she was aware of it, the warmth and the careful firmness of his grip. Then he took the horse's lead and walked them through the storm rather than ride, leading the horse steadily because the ground was becoming uncertain, and they moved through the dark and the rain together while the wind tried to argue them out of their direction. Halfway to town, above the sound of the storm, they both heard it, a cracking sound, low and final, from the direction of the homestead. Both of them turned. Through the rain dark they could see, just barely, the shape of the cabin's roof line, and it had changed. The northeast corner had come down. They stood in the rain and looked at it. Chester had his hand on the horse's bridle, and he did not look at her, because if he looked at her right now, he was not sure he could maintain the control that the situation still required. Georgia looked at it. She thought about what might have happened if he had not come. She thought about the candle on the windowsill and herself asleep in the bunk beneath that beam, and she felt the cold shock of the specific near-miss move through her. Then she felt something else, something hot and overwhelming, which was gratitude, not the polite kind she knew how to manage, but the real kind that came from the bone-deep understanding that someone had done a thing that mattered. She did not say anything. But when they began moving again toward town, toward the lights of Caldwell visible through the rain, she was crying. Quietly, not the kind of crying that asked for notice, the kind that happens when a feeling is too large to hold. The rain covered it. Chester Merritt, who was not a man who missed things, heard it anyway. He brought her to Ruthie McAllister's boarding house. Ruthie, who was 60 years old and had seen everything, answered the door in her nightcap, took one comprehensive look at them both, and brought Georgia inside with an efficiency and warmth that did not require explanation or justification. Chester stood on the boarding house steps in the rain for a moment after the door closed. He put his hand flat against his chest, where the clenching feeling had not entirely gone. Then he went back out into the storm to check on the rest of the town. In the morning, when the storm had passed and Caldwell was glistening wet under a scrubbed-clean sky, Chester went back out to the homestead. What he found confirmed what he had suspected from the sound. The northeast corner of the roof had partially collapsed, bringing down approximately a quarter of the structure. The main beam had finally given, just as he had known it would. The bunk where Georgia slept was under fallen timber. He stood there looking at it for a long time. The creek was running high from the rain, silver bright in the morning sun. The cottonwoods were dripping. A meadowlark was doing something enthusiastic in the tall grass, apparently unmoved by the drama of the previous night. He rode back to town. He found Georgia sitting at Ruthie's breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking like someone who had spent the night doing very little sleeping but a great deal of thinking. She had clearly been told about the cabin already. He could see it in her expression. And she was doing that thing she did, where the surface of her face arranged itself into composure while the deeper geography of her told a completely different story. He sat down across from her. Ruthie appeared briefly, set another coffee cup in front of him without being asked, and disappeared with the tact of a woman who understood the situation. "How bad?" Georgia asked. "A quarter of the structure." "The bunk area," he said it directly because she would want it direct. "The walls are still standing in the main section. The hearth is intact. It can be rebuilt, Georgia. It will take time and materials and help, but it can be rebuilt." She nodded. She took a careful sip of coffee. "How long?" "Depending on what help we can organize, several weeks, perhaps a month." She was quiet for a moment. "I cannot stay at Ruthie's for a month. I cannot afford it." "I know," he said. Another pause. He was watching her face and she knew it and didn't look at him. "There is the Bower place," she said finally, "on the other side of the Keller Creek. They went back east in April. It is sitting empty." "The roof is in poor condition," he said immediately because he always knew. "And there is a question of legality staying on someone else's claim without permission." She looked at him then, direct, a little challenging. "Then what are you suggesting, Marshal Merritt?" The use of his formal address after months of what had been building between them landed with a small sting he did not show. "I have a room," he said, "at the office. A back room I have never used for more than storage. It is small, but it is sound, and it is warm, and you would have privacy because the main office is on the other side of the building." She stared at him. "You are offering me a room in the Marshal's office. I am offering you a safe place to stay while your cabin is repaired. No cost, no obligation, no," he seemed to search for the right word, "no expectation of anything other than that you are safe and have a roof over your head." The silence between them had a quality she could not quite name. It was not comfortable silence, but it was not uncomfortable in a bad way. It was the silence of something that was being very carefully said and very carefully not said at the same time. "People will talk," she said. "People in Caldwell talk about everything," he said. "I have never found it a good reason to make a worse decision." Look directly at her. "But if it matters to you, I can arrange for it to be known that you are there under the authority of the Marshal's office as a displaced homesteader awaiting repair, which is the truth." She thought about it. She thought about her options, which were limited and getting more limited the more she thought. She thought about what it meant to accept his help again, and whether the sum of all his help was building into something she was not sure she knew how to handle. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Yes, she moved into the back room of the Marshal's office that afternoon. It was, as he had said, small. It had a narrow cot and a chest of drawers and a hook on the wall and a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which was more than she had been getting in the cabin. Chester had put a hook latch on the inside of the door between her room and the office, put it on with his own hands while she was settling in, quietly and without ceremony, and that gesture, more than anything else, told her something important about the kind of man he was. The town talked, of course. She had expected nothing else. Millicent Howe reported to her, with the cheerful precision of a very good friend, exactly what was being said, and the range of it was predictable. Some people found it entirely reasonable, and others found it entirely scandalous, and a few found it both, which was probably the most accurate position. Georgia acknowledged it with the composure of a woman who had decided that her own knowledge of the truth of the situation was more valuable than other people's speculation. She and Chester developed a new pattern. Mornings she would make coffee on the small stove in the office. He had a stove, a good cast iron one, and a supply of proper coffee beans, and they would have it together before the official day of the office began. These mornings became the thing she looked forward to most. He would tell her about the town, things he had noted on his rounds, problems on the horizon. She would tell him about the progress of the cabin repairs, which she was organizing herself, calling in favors and making arrangements with the practical energy that she had come to understand was her strongest quality. And gradually, incrementally, in the way of two careful people who had both been hurt before and were both trying not to be hurt again, they told each other more. He told her about Missouri, about Clara. Not everything at once, not in a single revelation, but in pieces, the way you reveal something painful one corner at a time, letting the light in gradually. He had been reckless as a young lawman. He had thought his own skill was sufficient armor against the world. He had been wrong, and the cost of that wrongness had been his first marriage and very nearly his life. And the lesson he had taken from it was that the people you loved paid the price of your mistakes. She listened to this without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The lesson you should have taken is that you were 22 years old and you were still learning." He looked at her. "That is not. You have been punishing yourself for 14 years for being young and still becoming who you were going to be," she said. "That is not wisdom, Chester. That is just a long time to carry something." He did not answer her right away. But something in his expression shifted, like a window being opened in a house that had been closed too long. She told him about Garrett Holt. Not all at once either, but the main facts. The letter, the dispute, the death that had not been an accident, the sheriff in Dodge City who had accepted the drive boss's version without question, the helplessness of having a truth and no way to prove it or use it. Chester listened with the same complete attention he brought to everything, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time and she could see him thinking, turning the information over with the methodical precision of a man who worked with evidence for a living. "I wrote to Albert Pruitt in Dodge City," he said, "in June, after I saw Holt in the street." She stared at him. I did not know what I was looking for then. I knew something was wrong. I wrote asking about incidents involving Holt on cattle drives. He stood up and went to his desk and came back with a letter. The reply came last week. I was deciding how to give it to you." She took the letter with fingers that were not entirely steady. It was from Albert Pruitt, sheriff of Ford County, and it informed Marshal Merritt that Garrett Holt had in fact been the subject of a complaint from the widow of a drover who had died on a drive in 1874, prior to Hale's death, and that this complaint had not been fully investigated at the time due to insufficient evidence, but that it was on record. Also mentioned that another drover had died on a Holt Run drive in 1876, the year after Hale, and that in this case there had been a witness who had come forward but then recanted. Georgia read it twice. Then she put it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. "There is a pattern," Chester said. "That is not nothing." "It is not enough," she said. "Not for a court." "Not yet," he said. "But Pruitt is willing to look harder if we give him reason to. And I know a federal marshal in Wichita who has broader jurisdiction." He paused. "If you want to pursue this, I will help you, every step. If you do not want to, if it costs more than you are willing to spend, I will also understand that." She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming in through the east window of his office, falling across both of them, and she thought with a sudden, almost painful clarity, "Here is a person who is genuinely, completely on my side, not because he owes it to her, not because he wants something in return. Simply because he is the kind of person who stands beside people who need standing beside." "I want to pursue it," she said. He nodded. "All right, then we will." They began working on the Holt matter together, which required letter writing and careful research and considerable patience, but which also gave them a shared purpose that drew them closer together in a way that was obvious to everyone in Caldwell except, arguably, themselves. But Caldwell noticed. Millicent Howe noticed. Ruthie McAllister noticed. Even Claude Howe, who generally noticed very little beyond inventory and accounts, remarked to his wife that the Marshal seemed to have acquired a new quality of expression recently, something that suggested he was looking forward to mornings. The cabin rebuilding progressed through July. Georgia had organized it herself. Pete Abernathy came back to help, along with 2 other men from the surrounding claims who had agreed to help in exchange for help with their own fall harvests. Chester came out on weekends, when his official duties allowed, and worked alongside them. Georgia watched him work. He was good at it, better than she would have expected, the kind of physical competence that came from a life in which you could not always pay someone else to do things, and she felt something accumulate in her that she could no longer comfortably classify as simply gratitude or appreciation. It was more than that. It had been more than that for a while. One evening in late July, when they were both sitting on the steps of the Marshal's office in the cooling dusk watching the main street of Caldwell settle into its nighttime quiet, he had said, out of a silence that had been perfectly comfortable, "Are you happy here, in Caldwell?" She had thought about it genuinely, not reaching for the automatic comfortable answer. "I am becoming someone here," she said finally. "That feels more important than happy." He had looked at her with that expression she still could not fully decode, the one that showed more than he meant it to and less than what was actually there. "What kind of someone?" "The kind I intended to be," she said. "The kind who does not need to be rescued even when she needs help." She paused. "There is a difference." "Yes," he said, "there is." He was looking out at the street. "For what it's worth, I have never thought of you as someone who needed rescuing. But you came in that storm." "That was not rescuing," he said. "That was—" He stopped, started again. "I could not another stop," and she heard in the space of his stopped sentences the thing he was trying and failing to say, and she felt her heart do something that was almost physically inconvenient. "Chester," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing something specific to his face, showing the lines of it more gently than daytime did, and he looked in that moment, not like the fierce and controlled Marshal the town saw, but like someone who was very tired of maintaining so much control. "I care about you," he said, getting it out with the directness of a man who has finally decided that the cost of not saying the thing is higher than the cost of saying it. "In a way that is not simple and is not going to go away if I ignore it, which I have been trying to do for approximately 6 months. He held her gaze. "I am telling you that so that you can—" He paused. "So that you can decide what you want to do with that information." Georgia looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he began to look slightly uncertain, which was one of the most remarkable things she had ever seen on that particular face. "I care about you too," she said. "I have been trying not to, because it felt complicated and I did not come to Kansas to fall in love. I came to build a life, and I was not sure those 2 things were compatible." She paused. "But I think I have been wrong about that." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and something in them opened, just slightly, like the first crack of light under a door. "You think," he said, and there was a very small, very private smile on his mouth, "the rarest thing in Caldwell, Kansas." "I am fairly certain," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just put his larger calloused hand over hers where it lay on the step between them and held it. It was the simplest thing. It undid her completely. They did not announce anything. They did not need to. Caldwell was a small town, and the adjustment in the distance between Marshal Merritt and Georgia Wilcox was visible to anyone who had been paying attention, and everyone had been paying attention. The cabin was rebuilt by mid-August. Chester had found a carpenter named Jonas Welland passing through on his way west who had agreed, in exchange for a fair wage, to spend 2 weeks replacing the damaged structural elements properly, with good timber and true joints. The northeast corner was rebuilt from the ground up. The main beam was replaced with a single piece of timber that Jonas Welland vouched for with the confidence of a craftsman who took these things personally. When it was done, Georgia had walked through the rebuilt space and run her hands along the new walls and stood under the solid ceiling and felt something complete itself in her. This was hers. This was genuinely, solidly, safely hers. The feeling was different from the feeling she had had in the beginning, less desperate, more rooted. She had built this not alone. She had not built it alone, and she was no longer ashamed of that, but the core of the decision and the determination had been hers, and that made the result hers too. Chester came to see the finished work. He stood in the rebuilt cabin, looked at the new beam, knocked on the northeast wall, and pronounced its sound with the same blunt authority he brought to everything. Then he had looked at her and said, "I want to ask you something." Georgia had looked at him. The afternoon light was coming in through the new window he had overseen the installation of, and it caught the silver that was beginning to come in at his temples, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a genuinely beautiful man in a way that he himself seemed entirely unaware of. "Ask," she said. "I want to court you properly," he said, "with your permission, not whatever we have been doing," which is, he paused. "I am not certain what to call it." "Building something," she said. "Yes. I want to do that with," he was choosing his words with the care of a man who knew their weight, "with intention. With the understanding that I am asking you specifically to let me be in your life, not as your marshal or your neighbor or the man who fixes things when they break, as the person who," he stopped, and then, with a kind of determination that was almost painful to witness, "I am 36 years old and I have spent 14 years being certain that I was better on my own. I do not believe that anymore. I want to be with you, Georgia, and I want to do this the right way." She crossed the space between them, because it seemed excessive to make him stand there with those words hanging in the air while she composed herself at a distance. She stood close enough to see all the things his face was trying not to show. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission." The autumn of 1878 had arrived with Georgia Wilcox, a widow and a stranger and a woman in crisis. The autumn of 1879 arrived with Georgia Wilcox, a woman who had built something, who had roots in the Kansas soil she had turned with her own hands, who was being properly courted by the Marshal of Caldwell in the manner of two mature people who both knew what they wanted and were no longer afraid to want it. It was a courtship that suited both of them. He came to the homestead on Sunday afternoons, and they would walk the property together, checking the fence lines, talking about the coming harvest, gradually letting the conversations become the kind that two people who were genuinely interested in each other have, ranging, exploratory, full of unexpected corners. He took her to dinner at the only establishment in Caldwell that could reasonably be called a restaurant, a place run by a woman named Dolores Reyes, who had come up from Texas with her family and cooked with a directness and confidence that Georgia deeply admired. He brought her books. She found this the most touching thing, the particular thoughtfulness of choosing books for a specific person. She made him meals at the homestead, because cooking was something she was genuinely good at, and it pleased her to feed him, to see the way he ate with the quiet appreciation of someone who had subsisted largely on boarding house food for most of a decade. She discovered that he had a dry, precise sense of humor that only appeared once he felt entirely comfortable, and that making him laugh, which was rare enough to feel like an achievement, gave her a specific satisfaction she would not have predicted. The whole matter, meanwhile, was progressing. Chester had been in communication with both Albert Pruitt in Dodge City and the federal marshal in Wichita, a man named Benjamin Hare whom Chester had known since his Wichita years. In October, Pruitt located the witness who had recanted his testimony about the 1876 death, a drover named Samuel Oakes who had been intimidated into silence by Holt, and who, now that Holt was no longer in a position to find him, was more willing to speak. Pruitt's letter described Oakes' account of the 1876 incident, which was consistent with deliberate violence disguised as accident, and which was also consistent with what Hale's letter described about the 1875 incident. Georgia read all of this correspondence with Chester, sitting across his desk in the Marshal's office on an October evening, and she felt the thing inside her that had never quite healed begin to close up differently. Not healed exactly. She did not think that was the right word for what happened to a grief like this, but settling into something she could carry, a truth that was being acknowledged even if justice would remain complicated and partial. In November, Benjamin Hare made an official investigation into Garrett Holt. It was not a complete vindication. The legal standards of the time and place were imperfect, and what constituted sufficient evidence was a matter of ongoing and frustrating debate. But Holt was confronted with the accumulated testimony, including Oak's statement and a letter from another former drover whom Pruitt had located, and he was formally investigated, and his reputation was conclusively destroyed. He would not run another drive. The cattlemen's associations that hired drive bosses were careful, in their own way, about who they employed, and a man with an official investigation against him was finished in that work. It was not, Georgia acknowledged to herself, what she had wanted in the beginning. She had wanted something clearer, something that said plainly and publicly that what had happened to Hale was a crime and the man who committed it had been held to account. She had not gotten that. She had gotten a partial truth, officially acknowledged, and a measure of justice that was real even if it was imperfect. She sat with that for several days. Chester gave her room to sit with it, checking in without pressing, present without overwhelming. On the third day she came to his office in the morning before their usual coffee and said, "I have made my peace with what we were able to do. I want you to know that." He nodded. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Good," he said. "You deserve peace, Georgia." "So do you," she said. He looked slightly startled by this, as though it were a new idea, and she realized it probably was. 14 years of self-imposed isolation had left him without much practice in accepting things that were given to him freely. "I know," he said, and she could tell he was trying to actually believe it. Christmas in Caldwell in 1879 was not elaborate. The church organized a celebration with carols and a small community gathering, and Dollar's Rays cooked an enormous meal that half the town appeared to eat. Chester sat beside Georgia in the church and was not visibly uncomfortable with being beside her, which was, by that point, a statement in itself. Afterward, walking back through the clear cold night to where he had hitched his horse and she had her wagon waiting, he had stopped in the middle of the street and said, "I have something to ask you." She had turned to face him. The stars were extraordinary over Caldwell on a clear December night, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had always looked at it and told stories. And Chester Merritt was standing in the silver light of it looking at her, with an expression that had abandoned all of its usual careful control. "Georgia," he said, "will you marry me?" He said it as a statement, not a question, and then caught himself and said more carefully, "Will you marry me, please?" And the please at the end, that rare please, undid her just as thoroughly as the first one had in the storm-soaked cabin doorway, and she felt her eyes fill up in a way she generally found undignified and in this case could not prevent. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Chester." He exhaled, and she realized he had not been certain what she would say, and that the uncertainty had cost him something, and she loved him so specifically in that moment for the vulnerability of it, for the fact that this controlled, careful, fierce man had made himself genuinely uncertain by asking, that she stepped forward and put her arms around him without allowing herself to second-guess it. He held her. He was very good at it, which surprised her slightly, given that he was not a demonstrative person in the general run of things, but he held her with the same complete attention he brought to everything, and she felt it in the marrow of her. They married in January of 1880. The ceremony was performed by the Caldwell minister, a round-faced earnest man named Reverend Culp, in the church on a Thursday morning, with Millicent Howe as George's witness, and a deputy named Len Cravath as Chester's. Ruthie McAllister cried loudly enough to be heard from the back pew. Dollar's Rays brought food afterward. It was a small and practical and entirely perfect event. Georgia did not move into the Marshal's office. Chester moved into the homestead. This was a decision they made together, because the homestead was Georgia's built thing, her reclaimed thing, and because Chester had been living in the back room of a government building for 12 years and needed, as Georgia put it, to know what it felt like to come home to somewhere that was genuinely home. He adapted to it with the pragmatic ease of a man who understood that adaptation was not weakness. He brought his books and his good coat, and the small things that constituted the personal life of a man who had kept it very compressed. He gave Georgia's kitchen the serious consideration of someone encountering a proper kitchen for the first time in a decade, and had genuine opinions about the coffee. He knew where everything was in the barn within 3 days. He repaired a fence section that had been on Georgia's list for weeks, unprompted, on a Sunday morning before she was awake, and she found it done when she came out and had the specific sensation of being seen, of having her tasks noticed and valued. The homestead changed. Not because Chester imposed anything on it, but because two people's presence in a space is fundamentally different from one person's, and the cabin expanded to contain them both in ways that felt organic rather than forced. He put up a bookshelf along the east wall for the books. She enlarged the kitchen garden in the spring because she was feeding two now. They had conversations about everything. The running conversation that two people who genuinely like each other as well as love each other maintain across a life. The daily exchange of information and observation that constitutes intimacy as much as anything more dramatic does. He remained fierce. Georgia had not expected marriage to soften Chester Merritt in any fundamental way, and it did not. He was still the Marshal who walked toward trouble without changing his pace, who held the law in Caldwell with the patient, iron authority that had made the town function for 12 years. But there was a quality now in the evenings, when he came home to the homestead and put his hat on the hook she had installed specifically for it, a quality of arrival, of being genuinely somewhere, that she had not seen in him before. He was coming home to something, and whatever that did to a person who had been alone for too long, it did something, clearly and visibly good. The spring of 1880 brought surprises. The cattle season that year was busier than the year before, and Caldwell received more traffic than it had in some years, which meant more work for Chester and more nights when he was in town late, and Georgia was at the homestead with the evening settling around her. She did not mind it the way she once might have. She was not lonely the same way. She had the deep company of their ongoing conversation even when he was not physically present, the accumulated knowledge of him that meant she could feel him in the house even when he was absent. In May, she realized she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for a day, turning it over, feeling the weight and the wonder of it. She had not been sure she could have children. She and Hale had been married 3 years without conceiving, and she had quietly arrived at a private understanding that perhaps this was simply not going to be part of her story. The sudden revision of that understanding required some accommodation. She told Chester at dinner on a Wednesday evening. She set down her fork and said, without preamble, because they had both agreed early on that directness between them was the only way they worked, "I am going to have a baby." The expression that moved across his face was not something she had a category for. It went through several places at once: shock, which passed quickly, and then something that was joy but not the uncomplicated kind, joy moving through the filter of a man who had spent a long time telling himself that the things he cared about were the things that got hurt. And then, on the other side of all of that, something simple and real and radiant that she had never quite seen on his face before. He stood up from the table. She stood up too, because he was clearly going to come to her and she was going to meet him. He put his hands on her face and looked at her like she was something he had been looking for without knowing it, and she put her hands over his hands and looked back. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her forehead. Then he sat back down and picked up his fork and ate approximately 2 more bites of his dinner before setting it down again and simply looking at her with that new, open, luminous expression. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. He appeared to be having some private conversation with himself about whether to accept this. She watched him work through it and arrive at the other side. "I am going to try very hard," he said, which was, for Chester Merritt, a declaration of considerable depth. The summer of 1880 was warm and abundant. Georgia's crops were the best she had managed since arriving in Caldwell, a combination of better seed, better technique, and the additional help that Chester's presence and organization had made possible. The kitchen garden was extraordinary. She sold her surplus at the Saturday market, and the money went into the small household account that was steadily, satisfyingly growing. As the pregnancy progressed and autumn came on, Chester became, in a way that was entirely characteristic of him, methodical about preparation. He built a cradle. He built it himself in the evenings in the barn, with the careful precision he brought to all physical tasks, and it was a good cradle, solid and true. He researched the local midwife, a competent woman named Hannah Birch who had been delivering babies in the region for 15 years, and made arrangements with her far enough in advance that Georgia teased him about it. He did not find it funny. Or rather, he smiled the small private smile and kept on with his preparations. The baby came in January of 1881. In the depths of the second winter, Georgia had weathered in the cabin. Though this winter the cabin was solid and warm, and she did not lie awake listening to beams. Hannah Birch was there and Chester was there, and it was a hard labor and a long night, but at the end of it there was a boy. A boy with dark eyes and Georgia's stubborn chin, and a voice like a small trumpet, announcing himself to Caldwell, Kansas, and the surrounding territory without reservation. Chester held him with an expression Georgia had never seen on anyone's face and knew she would never forget. Complete and uncomplicated love, unguarded for the first time she could ever remember seeing him unguarded, looking at this new small person with the full force of everything he had been keeping carefully controlled for 14 years, and all of it good, all of it love. They named him James, after no one in particular. James felt like a name that belonged to itself, strong and clear. The years that followed were the substance of a life. Chester remained Marshal of Caldwell. The town had grown enough by 1882 to justify a second deputy, which took some of the most wearing work off his shoulders, though he was constitutionally unable to fully delegate. Georgia expanded the homestead operation steadily, adding chickens and then a few dairy cattle, developing a productive kitchen garden that supplied not just their household but traded regularly in Caldwell. She became, gradually and without particularly intending to, a person that other people came to in the town, other women mostly, who needed practical advice, or a direct conversation, or someone who had figured out how to build something from what seemed like nothing. Millicent Howe remained her closest friend. Their friendship deepened by years into the kind that requires no maintenance because it is simply solid. Dr. Elias Ford became a genuine friend to both of them, coming to dinner at the homestead monthly with the cheerful predictability of a man who had found a family to attach himself to and intended to keep it. James grew. He had Chester's methodical nature and Georgia's relentless curiosity, a combination that produced a small person of impressive intensity who wanted to know the reason for everything and would not be satisfied by inadequate answers. Chester was, as Georgia had predicted, a wonderful father, not in the dramatically demonstrative way, but in the consistent, present, paying attention way that mattered more across a life. He taught James to ride at 4, to read at 5, to track an animal print at 6. He told him stories about the law, about what it was for and why it mattered, in the way of a man passing something genuinely valued on. In 1883, Georgia had a second pregnancy. This one was harder than the first. She was 31 now, and the winter had been particularly brutal, and she had been tired in a way she could not always shake. But Hannah Birch was equal to it, and Chester was there for all of it with a steady presence that she had come to understand was the most fundamental thing he offered: steadiness. He was always there. He was always exactly himself. She never had to wonder. The second child was a daughter. They named her Clara, which was Chester's suggestion, offered with a quiet deliberateness that Georgia understood and did not question. Clara was not a memorial and not an apology. She was a new person in a new life, and she arrived squalling and specific and already clearly her own. By the time Clara was born, the broken cabin, that cabin that had tried to kill Georgia the night of the storm, and instead had been the vehicle by which everything changed, was unrecognizable as its former self. It had been added to twice. There was a proper bedroom for Chester and Georgia off the main room, and a room for James, and now a second small room would be arranged for Clara. The homestead had fences that stood without argument and a barn that didn't leak and fields that produced reliably. It was, by any reasonable measure, a farm, a real one. The thing Georgia had come to Kansas to built. Caldwell itself continued to grow and change. The cattle trade evolved. By the mid-1880s, the Kisham Trail was seeing less traffic as the railroads expanded, and the cattle business shifted its patterns, and Caldwell adjusted with the particular resilience of prairie towns that had survived worse than change. Chester adjusted with it, his role becoming more administrative and less physically dangerous as the wildest years of the trail town passed. He was 40 now, the silver more than threads at his temples, the lines of his face deeper, and Georgia found him more beautiful now than she had the night he stood in her doorway in the rain, which she had not anticipated and could not entirely explain, except that beauty in a person you love is partly the accumulation of all the moments that have passed between you and all the ones still ahead. They still had the ritual of morning coffee. It had never broken, not once in the years of their marriage, through sleepless nights with babies and difficult harvests and the various crises that a life produces. Mornings together, coffee, the ongoing conversation. She told him things she told no one else. He told her things he had kept compressed and private for so long that getting them out was sometimes slow and sometimes required several attempts, but she had patience for it, the patience of someone who understood that slow things were worth waiting for. In the summer of 1885, something happened that Georgia had not anticipated, and that required every resource she and Chester had between them. A fire started in the dry goods store, Millicent and Claude Howe's store, on a hot August afternoon when a lantern was knocked from a shelf during a busy market day. The fire moved fast, as fire does in a dry Kansas summer, and before Chester and the volunteer fire company could get it contained, it had taken 3 businesses and the church and come close to Ruthie McAllister's boarding house. No one was killed. This was the overwhelming relief, the thing that outweighed everything else, and it was largely due to Chester's immediate organization of evacuation in those first minutes when the difference between bad and catastrophic was being decided. But the Howes lost everything. The store, their apartment above it, all their stock and most of their personal belongings. Claude, who was not a young man, had the particular gray devastation of someone who has seen the work of their life taken in an afternoon. Georgia's response was immediate. She opened the homestead to the Howes without asking Chester first, because she knew Chester well enough by now to know he would not only agree but would be ahead of her on the offer. Millicent and Claude stayed in the larger bedroom that Georgia and Chester vacated. They moved onto a pallet in the main room with a child on either side for 6 weeks while the town organized the rebuilding. And Caldwell, being the town it was, did organize. Chester coordinated. Georgia organized the meals and the practical support. Dollars Rays fed the construction crew. Pete Abernathy, who had settled on a claim 2 miles east and become a reliable neighbor, came every day with his wagon and his back. By October, the house store was rebuilt, smaller but sound, and Claude had something back to stand on. Millicent had wept the afternoon they moved back in a way she almost never did, and had told Georgia that she had no idea how to say what the last 6 weeks had been. Georgia had held her friend and said, "You do not have to say anything. We would not be anywhere without you." That winter, sitting by the good fire in the rebuilt cabin with James asleep in his room, and Clara asleep in hers and Chester reading at the table, Georgia had looked around at the solid walls and the warm light and thought about all the contingencies, all the things that had to go exactly the way they had gone for this specific life to be the outcome. The storm and the beam, the doorway and the rain, one fierce, watchful man who had not been willing to let her stay in something broken one more night. She had said, not looking up from her own book, "Chester," he said, not looking up from his. "I am grateful to you," she said. He did look up then, gave her the small private smile. "For what specifically?" "The night you came in the storm," she said. "I have thought about it many times since, what might have happened if you had not come." "I was always going to come," he said, simply and without drama. She looked at him. "How did you know that you were going to come? How did you know you cared that much at that point?" He considered this seriously, giving the question the full weight of his attention. "I was afraid," he said, "not of losing you exactly, since I did not fully have you yet, but of a world in which you were not in it." He paused. That seemed like sufficient information. She crossed the room and sat beside him, close, in the way she had been crossing distances to be close to him for years now. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the warmth and the solidness of him and thought, "This is what I built. Not just the farm, not just the walls. This." Outside, the Kansas winter wind was doing its habitual work against the sides of the cabin. Inside, the fire was good and the lamp was bright and the children were sleeping, and Chester Merritt had his arm around his wife, Georgia, with the particular ease of a man who has finally, at long last, allowed himself to be exactly where he is. The years continued, because that is what years do. James, at 7, decided he wanted to be a lawman like his father, and then at 9 decided he wanted to be a rancher, and at 11 wanted to be a newspaper man, and Chester encouraged all of it with the patient wisdom of a man who understood that the process of deciding who to be was the work of a life and not a single moment. Clara was quieter than her brother, more interior, with a precision and intensity in how she did things that was unmistakably her father's, but expressed in ways that were entirely her own. She developed a passion for botany, for the plants of the Kansas prairie specifically, their names and habits and uses. And Georgia nurtured this with the genuine enthusiasm of a person who recognized in her daughter the same drive to understand the world that had brought Georgia herself to Kansas in the first place. By 1887, the homestead was 160 acres properly worked, with 30 head of cattle, a reliable corn and wheat operation, and a kitchen garden that Millicent Howe sometimes bought produce from directly for the store. Georgia had also taken on, gradually and informally, the work of teaching reading to 2 of the neighboring families' children whose parents could not easily spare them for the school in town, and this had grown, with the encouragement of Reverend Culp's successor, into a small informal school program on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She had not expected this. She had come to Kansas to farm. But she had discovered, in the particular way that people discover the things they are genuinely fitted for, that she was good at teaching, at explaining things clearly, at finding the angle from which a difficult concept became accessible, at the patience required to wait for understanding to arrive at its own pace. Chester, who had watched this develop with the complete attention he brought to everything about her, told her one evening that she was the most capable person he had ever known. She had looked at him. "You know remarkable people." "I know one remarkable person," he said, with the directness that she had learned to expect from him, the particular Chester Merritt directness that was not flattery but simply the statement of what he observed to be true. In 1888, Chester was offered the position of Deputy U.S. Marshal for the region, a position that would have expanded his jurisdiction significantly and come with a federal appointment and the attendant stability. He brought it to Georgia before making any response, because this was how they operated as people who consulted each other on significant things, not as a formality but as a genuine practice of shared decision-making. She had read the offer letter carefully. Then she had looked at him and asked what he wanted. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked first," she said. He had a small smile. "I like Caldwell," he said. "I like knowing the names of the people. I like the scale of it." He paused. "I am not certain I want a larger jurisdiction. I am certain I do not want to spend more time away from home." She had put the letter down on the table. "Then we decline," she said, and felt him settle and was glad she had said we. He wrote a polite letter of refusal to the federal office in Wichita. He remained Marshal of Caldwell, which he would continue to be for several more years, until a younger man, a former deputy named Will Saunders, who had learned the work in Chester's office and learned it well, was ready to take it on. The last years of the century were kinder to the Merritts than the first years had been. The farm was established and productive. The children were growing into themselves with the specific beauty that children have when they are allowed to be genuinely who they are. Chester was a man at peace with himself in a way he had not been for the first half of his life, and Georgia knew she was the reason for some of that, and the farm and the children were the reasons for more of it. And the wholeness of it was something she thought about with a gratitude that did not decrease with familiarity. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been in Ohio, the young wife in Millbrook who had felt herself narrowing down to the shape of someone else's life. She thought about the morning she had found the deed and decided to come west. She thought about the autumn day she had stepped off the train in Caldwell with her carpetbag and her grief and her stubbornness, and looked across a dusty Main Street and seen a man walking without hurrying toward something dangerous. She had not known then what was going to happen. She had not known she was going to build something real, something lasting, something of her own choosing. She had not known that the ruined cabin and the cracked beam and the storm were going to be the pivot point on which everything turned. She had not known that the fierce Marshal was going to come to her threshold in the rain and say, with that terrible certainty of his, that she was not sleeping in that broken thing one more night, and that she was going to argue with him, and then pack her bag and then cry in the rain while he walked her horse carefully through a storm, and that those things together were going to be the beginning of the rest of her life. She was glad of all of it, even the hard parts. Even the grief and the crumbling beam and the Dodge City sheriff who hadn't looked hard enough, and the 100 moments in that first year when she had wondered if she had made a catastrophic mistake. All of it had been the work of becoming who she was now, and who she was now was a woman she could fully inhabit. In the spring of 1890, James Merritt, who was 9 years old and had settled firmly, for the time being, on wanting to be a farmer and a lawman simultaneously, asked his father how he and his mother had met. Chester was mending a fence at the time. He was 46 years old, lean and silver-templed, with the look of a man who had made good use of his years. He set down his work and thought about it. "Your mother was a woman who came to Kansas to build something," he said. "She came alone, and she worked harder than anyone I had ever seen, and she had a cabin that was not safe." James, who had heard parts of this before but not all of it, sat on the fence rail and listened with the complete focus of a child who knows a real story is being told. "I went out in a storm," Chester said, "because I was not able not to, because the idea of her being in danger was not something I could accept." He paused, looking at the fence. She did not want to leave. She was not the kind of woman who left because someone told her to. "But the roof came down, and she was not in it because she trusted me enough to come." "Then what?" James asked. Chester looked over his shoulder to where Georgia was visible in the distance, in the kitchen garden, doing something efficient and purposeful in the way she did everything. He watched her for a moment. "Then everything," he said. The meadowlarks were loud in the tall grass. The creek was running clear and silver. 160 acres of Kansas grassland lay around them in the spring warmth, green and patient and real. Georgia Wilcox Merritt, who had come west with a carpetbag and a grief and a stubborn heart, and had built a life from the ground up, looked up from her work and saw her husband watching her from the fence line, and she raised one calloused hand in a wave that he returned with the small private smile that was, after all these years, still the rarest and most precious thing in Caldwell, Kansas. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The cabin was solid. The beam was sound. The home they had built together, from the ruins of a broken structure, and a threshold moment in the rain, stood firm and warm and completely, enduringly theirs.